Hello and welcome to the History Show on the RFM. My name is Cathal Brennan, and on today's show my co-presenter John Dorney from theirishstory.com will be conducting two interviews with historian Brian Hanley. Dr. Brian Hanley is the author of The IRA, A Documentary History, 1919 to 2005, The IRA, 1926 to 1936, and, with Scott Miller, The Lost Revolution, the story of the official IRA and the Workers' Party. He teaches history at University College Dublin. In the first part of the show, John and Brian will discuss the IRA during the emergency, and in the second half of the show, they will discuss the effect of the Troubles in Northern Ireland on Southern society. If you would like to listen to this or previous episodes of the History Show, go to http://nearfm.ie/podcast/the-history-show/.
Brian Hanley, we're talking about the IRA during the Second World War, or the emergency, as we call it in Ireland. And my first question is, why was the IRA still in business in 1939? Hadn't the independence of Ireland been achieved?
Well, from the point of view of the IRA, and indeed other Republicans, of course it hadn't, because one partition had meant that 6 counties were still under control of the British. And also, as far as the IRA were concerned, the Free State, even under De Valera, was still a puppet state, and that's the rhetoric they would have used of the British. Leinster House wasn't the real Dáil. Fianna Fáil had abandoned the Republican cause by entering Leinster House, and by 1939, of course, Fianna Fáil were already jailing Republicans. So as far as the IRA were concerned, the national struggle wasn't finished, and indeed it was intensifying, because in January 1939 they'd begun a campaign mainly in Britain, which they hoped would actually put the Irish question back in the forefront of international politics.
Mm-hmm. You've written before, and you've said to us before, that in the immediate post-Civil War period, what the IRA was most concerned about with actually overthrowing the Free State, the Southern State. Had that changed? Were they more concerned about the Northern State by this point?
It does begin to change a little bit, although the rhetoric is still very similar, and during the war years the hatred of De Valera and Fianna Fáil really intensifies. So actually they do rhetorically still very much abuse and attack the Free State. But from 1937, 1938, when the IRA is being reorganised to a certain extent, and particularly it's being led by Sean Russell, who, under the influence of Joe McGarrity in the United States, proposes a campaign aimed at ending partition. And it's McGarrity who says, this is an obvious point. Why aren't we putting all our efforts into winning back the 6 counties? This is the cause that will rally Irishmen everywhere. He says that as early as 33, 34 to the IRA, but it's really in the late 30s they begin to take it on board. It may seem obvious, but I mean, the numerically and organisationally, the strength of the IRA was in the Free State. They were still relatively weak in the north, although they were growing a little bit. And the weaker they got in the Free State, the stronger they got in the north, ironically, by the late 30s. So the north begins to have a bit more say. And obviously the emphasis of Northern IRA men was very much on the conditions that they lived under. So partition does become rhetorically more important, and also it becomes the focus of this campaign. But because of what happens during the war years, they also still despise the Free State. But this campaign is intended to make partition an international issue.
The bombing campaign in England was designed to end partition and to drive Britain out of Northern Ireland, is that right?
Well, I think, in the best possible scenario, maybe. I think what more realistically they hoped to do was make partition a huge issue because of bombs exploding in Britain, to very ambitiously have a plan that would paralyse part of British industry and the transport network, that would also have a propaganda effect of bombs in London, bombs in Manchester and bombs elsewhere, disrupt public life. This would force the British government into reconsidering its position in Ireland. It would force De Valera to take sides. Again, you have this, unrealistic, but at times, while the IRA reject what Fianna Fáil is saying, they still believe deep down that Fianna Fáil does want to end partition, and maybe, certainly Joe McGarrity believes that De Valera might, if activity doesn't take place within the Free State, if it's confined to Britain or maybe confined to the north, that De Valera will be forced to go along with it, and that a lot of Fianna Fáil supporters will tacitly support it, and that this will basically put partition back on the agenda and maybe force some kind of conflict between the Free State and Britain. So there's a whole variety of ideas. I think for a lot of ordinary IRA members, the campaign just gave them a focus. After years of political disputes and squabbles and of parading and drilling for nothing and always being told to expect war, but war not happening. This was war. This gave them something to do, and a lot of young men and women go to England, to take part in this campaign fairly enthusiastically, because this is finally the moment has arrived for the reopening of the conflict.
Is this before or after the World War breaks out?
It starts before. It starts in January 1939, and it continues for a little bit after war has broken out. I mean, there are still bombs being planted by the IRA in the spring of 1940, but that's the first couple of months. It does have an impact on British life. I mean, there hadn't been anything like it since the Fenian bombings, really. I suppose there's a bit during the War of Independence, but in the 1880s there'd obviously been bombs in London, so it does make the headlines, and it does cause disruption, and it also kills and injures numbers of people. That begins to decline as the summer goes on. You have the bombing in Coventry in August, which is a disaster. It kills 5 civilians. Eventually 2 IRA men are hanged because of that. But obviously when Britain goes to war, the IRA's campaign is an irritant, if that. So it's declined by the spring of 1940, but the IRA still rhetorically claim that it's ongoing, and it isn't until or I think around 1946 that the IRA officially declared that campaign is over.
Okay.
But in reality it's over by 1940.
The World War breaks out in September 1939. And what was the IRA's attitude to the World War?
Yeah, I think there's a whole range of attitudes within the IRA. The very simple one, obviously, is that Britain is in trouble. England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity. Britain is now at war with a major power, a serious enemy. This offers an opportunity for Irish Republicans to take advantage of that. That can range from the views of simply that it's going to make things easier for us. The British are going to have to, will be worried about what we can do, to those who believe, well, this is, there'd already been contacts between German intelligence and the IRA in the United States and elsewhere. This will open up new avenues of finance or arms. I presume a lot of members of the IRA don't think about it very deeply beyond the fact that it's going to cause major problems for Britain. Like a lot of Irish nationalists, there's in the early stages of the war a kind of feeling of it's a good thing to see the British taking a bit of a pasting. There'd also be, and this is expressed by people in Fianna Fáil and even broader society, they don't really believe the Germans are that bad because they've heard all this propaganda before, and it's only 20 years since the Black and Tans were in Ireland. People know very well the reality of what the British are capable of, so there isn't a visceral hatred of the Germans. And a lot of people don't think too deeply about Nazism. That doesn't mean they like it, but they're not. In our world, we know the realities of what the Nazis meant. People don't at the time. Then again, more controversially, there's a small number of IRA officers who by the late 30s I think had been attracted to far-right politics. The IRA is in a flux politically. There's all kinds of arguments and debates taking place. Some of them are interested in kind of Christian social teachings. Others are interested in the social credit and corporatism, all these ideas. So a few of them I think are attracted
these
to the
are
right.
fascist ideas, basically.
Some of them are attracted to fascist ideas. And that begins, certainly by 1940-41, you see elements of that in IRA publications. In 1939, you tend to see more neither king nor Kaiser type stuff.
Right. Current IRA men are most often accused of actual collaboration with Germany, and I'm talking about Sean Russell. Can you speak a little bit about their role during the war?
Well, Russell is the Chief of Staff from 1938, and he's the man who's really drives the campaign in England. He goes to the United States in 1939, and he leaves the IRA under the control of Stephen Hayes from Wexford, who's a close ally of his. Russell eventually ends up in Germany. So Russell had contacts with the Germans in the United States in probably 1937-38, and he goes to Germany during 1940. Again, even the very fact that he's spirited out of the United States, having been the FBI had been on his tail. He goes to Italy, I think, and then is brought to Germany. He's in Germany during the summer of 1940. He's, according to an account in the United Irishman, which is published, the Republican paper, published in 1951 for the unveiling of the Russell statue in Fairview Park. Russell is treated as a diplomat, as the leader essentially of a revolutionary army, as representative of the Irish Revolution. He's given special facilities. He's shown various military camps, and he meets leading Nazis, including von Ribbentrop, to discuss the possibilities of the IRA playing a role in Operation Sea Lion, which is the plan to invade Britain during the summer of 1940. Now, by the time Russell gets there, the Nazis have conquered France and most of Western Europe, it looks very much like these guys are going to be the winners. And Russell never, there's no record of Russell ever uttering any kind of pro-Nazi statements in terms of Nazi policy. What he was known for in the IRA was that he tended to avoid political discussions and was pretty uncomfortable with them. He'd been in the Soviet Union in 1925, and again, he'd never uttered any pro-communist statements. He's practical. He was popular with the IRA rank and file. He was Quartermaster General for a long time. He doesn't seem to be a very complicated person, except the fact that he's dedicated to this idea that the IRA are going to free Ireland from British rule. And he'd been a member of the Irish Volunteers since 1913. But by 1940, he is in Berlin. He's in the capital of Nazi Germany. He's meeting leading Nazis. And he seems to be basically prepared to aid them in an attack on Britain, which will involve them coming to Ireland as well, because the IRA will play a role in attacking the British in Northern Ireland, or perhaps in carrying out operations in the 26 counties as well, and the Germans are going to then obviously use that as part of their invasion plans. Now, the logic of that means obviously that the Germans are going to land in Ireland in some shape or form. Now, Russell dies on his way back to Ireland on board a U-boat, so this remains, conjecture. We don't know what would have happened. The IRA, in their publications by 1940, are saying they hope Germany wins, that they're talking about their German and Italian allies. They're talking about, the fact that this will mean freedom for Ireland. The victory for the Axis powers will mean freedom for Ireland. So rhetorically, they're saying that at home. Whatever about, the several hundred IRA men who are in the Curragh, and the others who are in jail, and the others who are on the run throughout the country, whoever's writing War News, which is their underground publication, is saying things like this.
I mean, it does call into question what they meant by a term like freedom, when you're talking about Nazi Germany.
Well, it's pointed out at the time by people on the left in the Irish Democrat newspaper in Britain, and in the Irish Workers' Voice, I think, which is the communist paper. They do argue that the IRA are applauding people who've subjected Abyssinia and Czechoslovakia and Poland and all these places to occupation. And they also point out again that the Belfast IRA officers approach Eoin O'Duffy during 1940 and ask him would he become involved with the IRA. Now,
O'Duffy,
again,
the former blue shirt leader.
The former blue shirt leader, former deadly enemy of the IRA. And it seems to be widely known because the communist paper says that Eoin O'Duffy is being courted by the IRA. So again, this would raise questions about what exactly do you mean by freedom, and who certainly a lot of Republicans surely couldn't have thought O'Duffy would have any kind of linkage with them. Again, there's a wider question which, without approaching it in a kind of moralistic way, which some people do now, about the level of knowledge of Nazism and all the rest. Certainly, a lot of Irish people during 1940, I think, didn't think too deeply about what Nazism meant, and they wanted to see Britain get some form of a bloody nose, and they'd constantly pointed out the hypocrisy of the British Empire claiming to be fighting for freedom when it held India and other places in subjection. They wouldn't have, a lot of the time, they don't seem to have considered too much about what the Norwegians or the Dutch or the Belgians thought about being occupied. In Sean Mulready, who was an IRA prisoner in the Curragh, he later became a communist, which possibly, again, his reminiscences are going to be coloured by that. But he was there when news came through of the fall of France, and he says, like hundreds of his former internees began to run around in delirious joy that France had fallen, because they believed this meant Germany was going to win. Now, again, retrospectively, he says, so they were celebrating the downfall of the birthplace of modern republicanism to the Nazis. And he says, I couldn't understand, and a few people in the camp, like him, then effectively broke politically with the IRA and formed their own organisation, and there was numerous splinters of, So I think it is a live question, and it does raise, it's one that's never really been adequately dealt with by Republicans. Post-war, a lot of them just kind of let the matter rest and didn't want to consider it. And then you also have Russell become such a kind of hero. His status is quite high in terms of Republican iconography, even though he's not a very successful chief of staff. The fact that he's a Dubliner, and there's a statue of him in Dublin, and better known, for example, than Moss Toomey, who was chief of staff for a decade, and who, doesn't achieve what the IRA set out to do, but in some ways is a much more effective leader for them. Russell would be much, there's no Moss Toomey coming, as far as I know, of Sinn Féin, but there have been Sean Russell ones, so.
In Britain, the IRA had a brief, fairly unsuccessful bombing campaign. Sean Russell investigated cooperation with the Germans. Here in Ireland, North and South, how big of a security problem was the IRA for the two states in Ireland?
I think they were a substantial enough problem for different reasons. In the North, first of all, nationalist resentment at how they were being treated, again, seems to to intensify in the late 30s. And again, I think there was a feeling among the nationalist community, and even among people like Cahir Healy, he'd been a Home Rule. Well, he'd been a Sinn Féiner, and then he became a nationalist party leader. They think the Germans are going to rescue them too, to some extent, you know. So there's a kind of feeling Britain's in trouble, and this might lead to a change in our circumstances. So the IRA begins to grow in the north, and they pull off a couple of stunts. I mean, they organise the burning of gas masks on the Falls Road, you know, as a kind of measure of defiance. They at various stages during the war, they take over cinemas and read out the proclamation. They steal arms from British bases. They carry out a number of operations. And even though they're under severe pressure, which they usually are anyway, within the 6 counties, they do manage to survive. And lots of them, internment is introduced. They're locked up in Belfast and in Derry. They're locked up on prison ship as well. There's escapes from Derry jail. There's gun battles with the police and the B Specials. One IRA man, Tom Williams, is executed in 1942. That, again, the nationalist community rallies round. Hundreds of thousands of people sign petitions calling for his reprieve. There is a wider constituency there, even if most of the nationalists aren't IRA supporters. There is, because of the way the state is set up and because of discrimination, the IRA is able to function to a certain extent without ever being a serious threat to the north at the same time. When the Americans arrive in 1942, over 100,000 of them, the IRA...
Stationed in Northern Ireland, yeah.
Stationed in Northern Ireland, the IRA condemns this, and some of the IRA even talk about, will they now become part of our enemy? And it just would be, ludicrous to even, whatever about even trying to fight the British, to try and fight the Americans as well, is just not on. So the war and all the rest complicate matters, but the IRA survives, and there's a whole northern culture from the 40s. A lot of these... Republican families in Belfast and all the rest, all of them are interned or jailed during the 40s, but it survives. And people like Joe Cahill, for example, sentenced to death in 1942. In the south, they're probably a little bit more of a threat in some ways, not in military capabilities, although there's probably a couple of thousand IRA members at the start of the war. They have a substantial amount of arms and equipment, a lot of which gets captured during the war. A lot of their Thompson guns are captured during the war years. They have a network. They have people all over the 26 counties. Still have, dedicated guerrilla operators and all the rest, including a few veterans of the War of Independence, Civil War. But the problem for De Valera is that if he wants to maintain neutrality, it means that he can't allow the 26 counties to be used as a base for attacks on England. The IRA, in theory, are trying to do that. This could be used by the British as an excuse to intervene, which of course the British do seriously consider intervening and invading the 26 counties during 1940. They could have used the IRA's links with Germany as an excuse. They could have used bombs in England as an excuse. So that does make them a security problem. And then they also, in December 1939, and it doesn't reflect very well on the state, but also rebounds on the IRA. The IRA carry out the robbery of the Irish Army's main magazine fort at the Phoenix Park and rob over 1 million rounds of ammunition, which is hugely embarrassing for the state. It's almost all the Defence Forces reserved ammunition. The IRA steal it. Most of it's recovered within a week because they haven't thought through how to hide all of this. But it does mean the government takes them very seriously. And there's a whole series of legal moves in the Offences Against the State Act and various things to try and make arresting the IRA and rounding them up easier. Now, there are difficulties. I mean, there's court cases and all the rest that the government loses, but eventually by 1940 internment is introduced. And also then, as the IRA begins to confront the state more physically, which is IRA members being chased by detectives, you have a whole series of gun battles and shootings, which brings the IRA into deadly conflict with the Gardaí, and then eventually leads to executions and also then prison protests and hunger strikes.
How many IRA men were executed in the war years?
6 are executed altogether during the war years. And
in the south now or in all of Ireland?
In the 26 counties.
Okay.
One is executed in the north.
So 7 in total.
One of the interesting things about that is the Tom Williams execution in 1942 is regarded as a major provocation by the Northern Irish government. And De Valera and other people support calls for clemency. De Valera, as diplomats in the United States, argue with the Americans that if Williams is executed, this will lead to a backlash against the British. It'll also, lead to trouble, and that he should be reprieved. And the newspapers, particularly the Irish Press and the Irish Independent, they give a lot of coverage to the campaign for Williams' reprieve. But of course, it's a completely different matter when IRA members are executed in the Free State. coverage of campaigns for their reprieves is heavily censored. One newspaper, for example, which uses the term murder to describe the crime for which Williams was convicted, is told by the censorship board to substitute the word killing of an RUC officer, where they're ordered to use the term murder for the killing of Gardaí, even though Gardaí were killed. Most of the Gardaí who were killed in gun battles, where, technically in court you could argue that the IRA didn't set out to murder them and didn't plan to murder them. They were usually shooting at IRA members as well. There's only one Garda who's killed in what might be assassinated. It's planned to kill him. But the Southern state is very clear that there won't be any room for clemency. There are protest campaigns, but these are kept, fairly under tight control. There's a lot of censorship, and the state takes a very different view of its policy of execution as compared to the North or Britain. There's 2 IRA men executed in Britain in 1940 for the Coventry bombing, and again there's a lot of publicity in Southern Ireland for a reprieve campaign. Fianna Fáil TDs speak out against this, and it's again seen as an example of young Irishmen being hanged by a vengeful British state. But that's not the position once it occurs, when executions occur in the Free State. Mm-hmm. There's around 1,000 jailed or interned altogether, and the numbers change because some people are jailed and then as soon as their sentences are served, they're just arrested again and put in the Curragh. Okay. So you have people in Arbour Hill, people in Mountjoy, hundreds in the Curragh, and also a number in Portlaoise, which is actually the hardest prison because that's where a number of IRA prisoners refuse to wear prison uniform. They effectively go on the blanket. A lot of them spend most of the time in solitary confinement. You have people like Sean McCaughey, who dies in hunger and thirst strike in 1946, held in Portlaoise. Eamon Smullen and Tomás McCurtain, they're in Portlaoise, which is the hardest place really to be an IRA prisoner. The Curragh at times is tough, but it's quite a different experience for the prisoners who are there. There you have people like Martin O'Kine, who becomes later on Professor of Irish at Trinity. A lot of IRA members learn Irish for the first time in the Curragh. You have Russian classes and German classes, and you have various little camp publications published, and a whole different kind of experience, which is, it's obviously not a pleasant experience a lot of the time, but it's quite different to being held in Portlaoise, for example. So that, again, in terms of Republican history and the people who come out of the Curragh, you have those who remain within the Republican movement, and the Curragh becomes part of that experience, but you have also those who leave and go in different directions. Rory Brua, for example, the son of Cathal Brua, eventually becomes a Fianna Fáil TD and politician. He's there. Martin O'Kine is there. Brendan Behan is there briefly. So you have a whole... Michael O'Riordan, the communist, is in the Curragh for a while as well.
Mm-hmm. As we look back at the IRA's role during the emergency, should we see them in the same light as collaborators like the Croat nationalists or Flemish or Breton nationalists, or should we just view it as an idiosyncratic Irish situation?
Well, the most important point, and it's also the luckiest one, is that Ireland, the 26 counties, weren't occupied by the Germans. So therefore, this is all hypothetical. And no matter how upset people get over this, the point is we don't know, thankfully. Unfortunately, the European lesson is that nationalists of whatever description who decided to cooperate with the Nazis almost always ended up doing their dirty work and being implicated in atrocities and oppression. Varied from place to place. Obviously in Eastern Europe it was a lot worse than it was in Brittany. But
it was still quite bad.
Yeah, and still quite bad. I mean, this is only in very relative terms. Yeah. There's no reason why it would have been any different in Ireland. And there were people who pointed that out. There was people in 1940 pointing out that the IRA's dalliance with the Nazis wasn't going to lead anywhere good. And you also, purely from the lessons of history, it should have been apparent that the German Empire, wasn't going to be any better than the British Empire. So, but it's hypothetical because there is a lucky escape. The IRA draws other lessons from the war years. One, a lot of its activists conclude that taking on the Gardaí in the manner they did, being so confrontational towards the government, was disastrous. And in the late 40s, they decide not to do that again. There is, however, a new impetus given to some of them in terms of there is a whole new experience of prison and of martyrdom, which then also provides a a backing for their efforts in the 1940s and 50s as well. So you've a lot of people who never become really active in Republican politics again after the war, but you've others who are given a greater desire to continue and see it as, it's a crucial part of their formation as Republicans.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Brian Hanley, thank you very much.
Welcome back to the second part of the History Show on the IRFM. In this part of the show, John Dorney from theirishstory.com will be discussing the effects of the Troubles in Northern Ireland on Southern Irish society.
It overshadowed certainly most of my life up till I was in my mid-20s. When I think about it, the North was always a constant. It was always, every morning essentially on the radio, something had happened in Northern Ireland. And it became clear to me that it had in so many ways had a major effect on Southern society. And I suppose what was interesting to me after I became a historian was that a lot of the histories tend to downplay the effect it had. I mean, there's major works done in the 80s and 90s that kind of argue that apart from a couple of major incidents, the North didn't have a major impact on Southern society really, or on Southern thinking. And I suppose that's confusing a direct impact with the actual importance of it and the way that it did play into a whole range of other issues, both culturally, socially and economically and politically. In the South, Roy Foster's recent work on the look of the Irish, a lot about it, which is about the fact that the South really recoiled from the North and didn't want to have anything to do with it. I think that's partly the case, but it's never entirely the truth, that there are much more connections than that. So what I'm particularly interested in, initially at least, is popular mobilisation and the times when large numbers of people in the South really did directly connect with the Northern issue and really felt involved with it. And that obviously then means you have to look at why, after a period, that enthusiasm began to decline, and where it does re-emerge again, and where other things come into play. After October 1968, firstly, initially with the big civil rights march in Derry, you see discussion of the North again, and you begin to see mobilisation in the South. For example, there's a pretty violent protest at the British Embassy in Dublin, which was then in Merrion Square after the October 5th march in Derry, and that's the first of several over the next few years. Then in August 1969, you have thousands of people rallying in Dublin, and also smaller rallies across the state of people demanding action over the North. Some demanding that the Defence Forces intervene militarily, or that the government intervene. You have the very public sort of prominence of the IRA in that period as well, with people actually talking about what the IRA should do or what the IRA is going to do. And you then have people fleeing the violence. From August 69 and again in 71 and 72, you have thousands of people coming south. You have the beginnings of small communities in Dundalk and in Drogheda and in Cavan and Monaghan and in parts of Donegal of people who've left the North for various reasons. And you also have refugees who are put up in Gormanstown camp or in other military camps. So here you have in the early years of the conflict. Of course, again, we know it's the early years of the conflict. The people at the time don't know it's the early years. They don't know how long this is going to go on, and they don't know what's going to happen. You do have a very emotional reaction and so political effects of that reaction. The crisis within Fianna Fáil, for example, arms crisis, very much brought about by the North. You have also upheaval in the Labour Party for a long period, because the Labour Party at the time has a very substantial anti-partitionist element who are on this subject actually as nationalistic, if not more so, than a lot of people in Fianna Fáil. And within the trade union movement, right from the start, there's a lot of interest in what's happening, because most of the trade unions organise in the North as well. So from 69 onwards, there's recurring collections within the unions for Northern Relief, for example, and for aiding families who come south. And again, that involves thousands of people, who's a large proportion of the workforce are members of trade unions. So the North is never really far from their experience as well. So it affects the South in a whole range of ways in the beginning, which I think is very interesting.
And maybe the hunger strike period as well?
Yeah, I mean, there you see apart from the early 70s, this is when the North comes back on the streets in a big way, and when it's really identified again with marches and with demonstrations and riots. And the mobilisation around the hunger strike is very significant in that in the early 70s, when the Troubles were in their infancy, nobody knew how bad they were going to get. By 1981, we'd already had a decade of them, so a lot of people in the South have really recoiled from them already. And what you see during the hunger strikes is that you have a younger generation who wouldn't have been active at all in 1970, who are identifying with the H-Block hunger strikers, identifying with republicanism, and who don't come from Republican backgrounds. I mean, one thing that's notable in Dublin is you have punks, skinheads, mods going on H-Block marches. And other people, people from New Ross, for example, have said, oh yeah, the lads we used to call the ska kids in the town, they all started to go on the H-Block marches. But it's much smaller than the mobilisation in the early 70s, even though it's still significant. And it has a political outlet in that you have elections in 81, 82, you have the election of 2 H-Block TDs, and this of course then feeds on, as we know, to the thinking in the Northern Republican leadership about the possibility of movement in the South. But in comparison to the early 70s, that was emotional, and there's emotion in 1981 as well, but in some ways it has a harder edge, it's more politicised, and it's also much more class-based. I mean, it's really apparent in Dublin. In 1981, a lot of the younger people who are being mobilised are from the poorest parts of Dublin, and the tension between them and the Gardaí carries a whole range of other baggage rather than simply that of Republicans versus Free Staters, and that's probably not the way they would have even seen it. And there's descriptions of the H-Block marches where you have Republican stewards trying to maintain order, trying to stop the younger people on the marches from attacking the police, or particularly breaking windows in shops and buses, which actually alienates a lot of the wider public. So I think then you do see a different type of mobilisation, but it is significant, and it then I think does have a longer effect in terms of Southern republicanism.
And that might help to explain why the political establishment here in the Republic wanted to keep a lid on popular involvement in the North. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, I'd say it is true, although again I would say that there's been a lot of rewriting since the early 70s about what people actually thought. I mean, there's no shortage of TDs in the early 70s who are making speeches about the need to finish the fight that should have been finished in 1921, or that should have been finished in 1923, depending on what party they're in. And there again are, at the 1971 Fine Gael Ardèche, there are quite a few speeches which, objecting to the use of the term Northern Ireland, for example. It's the 6 counties, saying that Jack Lynch had made a mess of it and that a Fine Gael Taoiseach could have been stronger. I mean, Liam Cosgrave at the time reiterates on numerous occasions that the only solution is a united Ireland, and the sooner people come to realise that, the better. He makes the point that no Irishman can be happy to see the British Army in Ireland. Across all the parties you have an emotional nationalist reaction. You also have those who obviously think it's worthwhile political capital. I mean, I think Charles Haughey would be an example of someone who wasn't notably Republican before 1969 and suddenly became very vociferously Republican. Within the Labour Party there's several splits, factional fighting about this issue. But by 1972, I think on the one hand there's a genuine fear among many people of the term would be the violence spilling over into the South. And the violence is spilling over into the South, both in terms of street conflict and also bombs and shootings by 1972. And also then, among the political establishment, a desire for stability, essentially. I mean, in 1972, there's a referendum on joining the EEC. It's passed. This is seen as a vital step towards the Republic becoming economically stable and successful. And the North really is seen as an unhelpful diversion from that. There are people who are genuinely nationalistic among the political elite, but most of them, I think, are pragmatic. And the North costs a huge amount of money. The Gardaí and the Army, the budget begins to escalate, funding them. There's a human cost. There's now bombs in Dublin, people being shot in the South. And also then there is periodic trouble, street disturbances connected with the North, and you have a growing prison population, then a growing problem with armed crime, a lot of which initially is carried out by paramilitary organisations, and just the worry that there's a huge mobilisation in the early 70s up till certainly 1972 in terms of solidarity with Northern nationalists, and I think a fear that can be revived again given the right circumstances. The Irish government, the Fine Gael Labour coalition in 1975-76 did believe that the British had told the IRA that they were leaving. So they were making preparations for what they thought was going to be a civil war in the North and a doomsday. The actual files are labelled doomsday. And I mean, they were really terrified of the prospect of thousands of nationalist refugees coming south. One report written by a senior Garda talks about a Lebanon-type situation with Northern nationalists, if they were held in camps along the border, becoming a really strong destabilising influence as well. there's reports drawn up from their informants in the north, a lot of whom I think were probably the clergy and the SDLP, about how long nationalist districts could hold out in a doomsday situation, you know. So the Irish government does think that the British are going to leave them in the lurch. I think Gareth Fitzgerald wrote publicly about that, you know, that they didn't trust to maintain the situation, and certainly that the coalition, I don't think any government after 1972 seriously considered a united Ireland as a positive prospect, and certainly the coalition thought we're going to have a civil war which we're not going to be able to handle.
So they thought there was going to be a civil war, and what did they plan to do if this came to pass?
Well, they weren't going to intervene militarily, and they had decided that they wouldn't go into Northern Ireland. They were obviously going to try and aid. I mean, they talk very much, and again, given later revisions, people may or may not be surprised by the fact, but they think exclusively in terms of Northern nationalists. I mean, most Irish politicians, Southern politicians, don't think that the Unionists were their responsibility or problem, and most of them blame the Unionists for having caused the problem in the first place. Some publicly, a lot privately. So, I mean, the nationalist population were the ones they were going to have to look after, and they thought thousands of these people are going to come here seeking refuge. Now, again, what's notable is that after 1972, there's a mixed response on Northern nationalists coming south. Again, culturally, you have that kind of conflict in towns like Dundalk, where, you know, people begin to argue that the town's getting a very bad image, El Paso, etc., because of its connection with the north. But again, I mean, there's one of the Garda assessments that makes this clear, you know, that Senior Garda talks about the fact that refugees are usually law-abiding people who are thankful for the aid that they're being given as they're being driven from their homes. But Northerners, as we've discovered, are often ungrateful, often demand much more than we can give them, sometimes cause trouble. It's a very negative view in many ways of Northern nationalists already in the South, certainly among some people by the mid-70s. And this certainly colours the view of the government as well. I mean, there's another revealing British diplomat has discussions with Paddy Hillary in 1972, a couple of months after Bloody Sunday. Now, this is the British recollection, so I don't know if it can be entirely trusted. But he says that Hillary says to him, you know, that people in the South are sentimental and emotional. They have been very upset over the North, but at the end of the day, they're not very hard people. Most of the violence is coming, particularly in the South, is coming from those who've come down from the North, and Northerners really are different. I think that's an interesting, it certainly wouldn't have been said publicly by a Fianna Fáil minister, but I think it does point again to the perception that a lot of people would have held.
What a Republican will tell you, what many Republicans will tell you about the southern aspect of the conflict was that the southern government physically and also kind of culturally, or in the realm of ideas, tried to repress the Republican movement.
Well, they did try to repress them because they saw them as a threat to the state. I mean, in 1972, Des O'Malley has spoken publicly about the fact that, you know, the official IRA, the provisional IRA, and Serra, which would have been the three main Republican paramilitary organisations, were a threat to the state, and the Loyalists weren't a threat to the southern state really, although they became a physical threat because of their bombings, which the South did not see coming. And the Finlay report, which is a secret report compiled after the escape of senior provisional IRA prisoners from Mountjoy by helicopter in 1973, huge embarrassment to the state. They authorised a major report into state security, and that comes to the conclusion, perhaps surprisingly, that the official IRA are the greatest threat to the southern state. Second come the provisional IRA, because their main focus is on the north, but that could change. And then thirdly, Loyalists, who aren't thought to be a major threat. And the reason why we know that, because the report has never been released, is because of the Barron Commission into the Dublin-Monaghan bombings. And it gives you some indication of the fact that the southern state did not really see anything like Dublin-Monaghan coming. So the Republicans are seen as a threat to the state. And there's also a fear, which is expressed then most graphically by Conor Cruz O'Brien and popularly by a few others, that basically the southern state prides itself on its origins from the revolution. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael and even some of the Labour Party are very proud of the old IRA. Therefore, most people in the South, deep down, have an emotional attachment to republicanism. And this is dangerous because it can be exploited by the IRA. Now, funnily enough, the flip side of that is the view among Republicans that deep down most people in the South are Republicans as well, and that their only only through censorship or misinformation is this republicanism being held in check. And ironically, that's held by two opposing poles, really, by we might call the arch revisionists and the Republicans themselves. I think there's certainly an element in that most people in the South did have an attachment to the idea of the independence struggle. But one of the interesting things I think about the view of the IRA in the South was that people really did believe in a good old IRA, and they didn't believe that the provisionals were anything like the good old IRA. So this is always a problem for Republicans. And there's censorship, there is an effort made to disengage, and in some ways that's very successful, because I think even today, if you hear a politician from Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael or Labour talking about the Irish economy, they mean the 26 county economy. If you hear them talking about it being unpatriotic to shop in Newry, which Fianna Fáil ministers did a few years ago, well, that's a partitionist mindset to kind of phrase. And they honestly, I don't think, even think about what they're saying when they say things like that. But it does mean most people in the South do, when they think about Ireland, they think about the 26 counties. And that's already apparent in the 1970s, I think. What you can blame for, of course, is another day's work. And I suppose what's significant about civil liberties and repression is that there is an enormous amount of leeway given to the state here, which would be hugely controversial in Britain in the 1970s or even in the United States. That people can be held on the word of a senior Garda, that a senior Garda can tell a judge that he believes a person is a member of a subversive organisation and that his word is all that is needed. Now again, Americans would be surprised, certainly pre-2001, at this kind of level of trust in the police and lack of accountability. The Special Criminal Court, the very stringent Offences Against the State Act, all those things are part of a response to the Northern conflict, which then become accepted by many people as kind of natural and aren't often. I mean, when I sometimes give lectures or talk to students in tutorials about aspects of the laws in Ireland, I mean, they're surprised to hear that, you know, it isn't the case that in every country that a policeman's word is simply taken for granted and you could be held, you know, without any evidence at all. But this is, you know, part of the response to the conflict. And of course, people like Des O'Malley and others argue that it's absolutely necessary, because that by 1972, the paramilitary organisations were becoming so confident, so brazen, that you couldn't have had a normal judicial system. And that they proved how brazen they were by their bank robberies, by their numerous attempts to break people out of prison, some which are successful, by their killing of people here, including not just Gardaí but also politicians. Senator Billy Fox of Fine Gael killed in Monaghan, for example, in 1974, and that really stringent security measures were needed to combat, subvert the level of use of the army to back up the Gardaí, for example, and of sweeping judicial powers and censorship, is something that I think it's been taken for granted without really being examined how pervasive that was and what it did to the way people behaved.
But if you talk to unionists, for example, they'll point to the 1950s, when the IRA campaign then was more or less strangled by Southern repression, if you like, or use of internment, and that didn't happen in the conflict from the 70s onwards. So why didn't it happen?
Upsurge in the north after 1969 had a much bigger popular basis than the border campaign ever had, and had a real popular basis among nationalists in Northern Ireland, which then also for a while fed into a lot of sympathy and solidarity in the south. And internment, certainly by 1971-72, probably would have been a disaster in the Republic as well. I mean, it probably would have been possible, but it wouldn't have been accepted as it was in 1957, when relatively small numbers of people are being locked up, and people, no, it isn't the case that internment's popular among the general public in the 1950s. It's seen as something which had occurred in the 40s, and it's been done by De Valera and others, in fact. So it has some kind of legitimacy. Fianna Fáil threatened internment in December 1970. And there's a real controversial episode where Des O'Malley and others argue that they have information that subversives are going to kidnap government ministers. Internment might have to be introduced. And that's a public relations disaster. It's seen as essentially a PR move to try and win a by-election. And there's a backlash. And of course, it's very embarrassing when in August 1971 internment is introduced in Northern Ireland, because obviously Jack Lynch condemns internment, says it's wrong, and the unionists respond, well, weren't you going to bring it in last year? Not just that you brought it in the 1950s, and I think that, so there's a number of reasons why internment wasn't really possible by the early 1970s. And plus, its use in Northern Ireland really ruled it out in the south. It's now become a byword for brutality and for also, arresting the wrong people, in a way that it hadn't been actually up till then, to be fair. I mean, a lot of people in the south would have thought internment was a fairly useful weapon, and of course, it was still on the books. It could have been introduced.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those counterfactual things. We'll never know what would have happened had it been brought in. So, we'll move on, and just briefly, if you could you suggest, in terms of violence, how was the southern state affected by the Troubles?
Well, one of the ways that it's affected, and it's been, again, I think in popular memory, it's largely been forgotten. Most people have obviously heard of the Dublin Monaghan bombings, the single biggest up to Omagh, the single biggest, and still the biggest in terms of fatalities, bombings of the Troubles. A member of the UVF is killed by his own bomb in Donegal in 1969. You've bombings in 1970, pretty small scale. By 1972, from the summer of 1972 onwards, bomb scares and bombs become a feature of life, really, at times in Dublin and also particularly in the border counties. And some of those bombs cause fatalities. There's bombs in Belturbet in Cavan, bombs in Clones and Monaghan, bombs in Donegal. Up till 1976, bombs in Dundalk as well, and sometimes loyalists, gangs cross the border and kill people. The bombings in December 1972 in Dublin, and again in January 1973, and the major bombs in 1974. So around over 50 people are killed because of usually loyalist bombs.
If I remember right, in the 90s, the loyalists were talking about restarting that. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, they attempted bombs again after the Anglo-Irish Agreement in the late 80s, and they were always fairly small incendiary type devices, shops. 1994, in a major, the UVF attempted to bomb a Republican function in a pub in Dublin, and they were prevented from entering the pub by a doorman who was a member of the IRA, and Martin Doherty, and he was shot dead, and the bomb didn't go off. Had it done so, it had the potential to kill a large number of people. But again, of course, there's a whole. I won't go into the whole argument about collusion and about the strategy behind the loyalist bombings. There certainly is a difference in terms of technology in comparison to from 1970 to 1976, when the loyalists are very capable of car bombings in the Republic, and then the late 1980s, when most of their bombings tend to be incendiary devices in shops and all the rest of it, that cause small fires but don't cause fatalities. And obviously there's a huge question about both the December 1972 bombs in Dublin and the Dublin Monaghan bombings, about the level of technology and the strategy that's been employed. But just in terms of pure infliction of casualties, there's bombings up till 1976, and it makes people very nervous. I mean, people of a certain age will tell you how on any given Saturday Henry Street or Grafton Street might have to be cleared because of a bomb scare, and how bomb scares were a regular part of life in the south, which in a way that it'd be completely, seem very strange now. Members of the Gardaí who were killed or wounded, members of paramilitary organisations who were killed and wounded as well, street disturbances, there's a number of major hunger strikes in Portlaoise in the 70s, which almost lead, in both 1975 and 1977, people come close to dying on hunger strike in prison, which would have been the first time that had happened in the Republic since the 1940s. And it comes pretty close. I mean, these are pretty bitter occasions, very, very hostile relations between prison staff and Republican prisoners, a lot of violence at the protests over the prisoners, a lot more support in some ways than you'd imagine for the prisoners at various stages. I mean, in 1974 there's a big breakout from Portlaoise of IRA prisoners, and 19 men escape, and a song celebrating the escape called 19 Men gets to number one. You have this kind of complex mixture of sympathy, which isn't reflected in many ways in mainstream politics. At the same time, a level of fear as well of this conflict spreading, and of the people who are presumed to be intent on spreading it. I suppose one of the things which I've found, which has forced me to reassess my own thinking in some ways, is that there's a very pervasive view that until Gerry Adams and others take the leadership of the Republican movement in the North, only then does Sinn Féin become a cohesive political force. And that really, up till then, Sinn Féin in the south were just people who collected money and sold newspapers. Looking at it again, I think you had a much more vibrant Republican organisation in Southern Ireland than most people imagined. You have lots of people from across the state involved. You have councillors elected. You have attempts to build up political profile, and you have a lot of very interesting ideological debates in the south as well, which I won't go into, but you do have a Sinn Féin organisation here. Now, there is a tension between them and the Northerners, and that becomes really apparent in the early 80s. You do have the dominance post-hunger strike completely of the Northern leadership, but the Northerners do recognise that there is potential in the south, and there is also a new generation attracted to the Republican movement by the prison protests. Danny Morrison writes in the early 80s about how, the ghetto population of the south is where we're going to grow. And in some ways, again, retrospective, you can look at it and you can see, well, maybe he didn't really understand, in some ways, southern society. But they do think that it's certainly among the poorest areas of the south that they're going to emerge as a force. They look at the relative success of the Workers' Party, and I think that can be emulated as well. They do begin to eventually move towards more taking elections more seriously, certainly, and trying to build up themselves in particular communities as well. And there's lots of failures and some successes along the way to do that. But Sinn Féin in the 1980s, even though many of those people would still be involved in Sinn Féin today, it still is quite different culturally an organisation than Sinn Féin now, I think, in some ways. Much more rhetorically revolutionary, for example, very hostile to the southern establishment, still calls it the Free State, unapologetic about the IRA's armed struggle, obviously, not just unapologetic, but actually, completely in support of that, and would often be engaged in a lot of confrontation with the forces of the southern state, which of course the southern state was also engaged in confrontation with them, because being active in Republican politics meant, at the very least, being questioned by the special branch. There is a shift in terms of Republican strategy, but I suppose I'd like to look again at maybe at what Republicans were doing in the early 70s to try and reintegrate that into the story. Some of the Northern Republican leadership begin to recognise that emotional solidarity isn't enough. In the 70s, you see a lot of Republicans from the North, when they appeal for support in the South, tends to be on the basis that your people are being attacked, why don't you do something about it? Maura Drum makes a speech in Limerick in 1971 to what she considers a small crowd, and she says, I don't think the people of Munster want us to be free at all. And it's very much, why aren't you doing more? And actually, at the end of the day, that doesn't put butter on the spuds, to be honest with you. Most people aren't driven by purely moral appeals. And you have in the mid-1980s Jerry Adams, for example, arguing that we can't expect support in Ballymun because of the Brits kicking in doors in Ballymurphy, which is an important recognition of the fact that conditions of Northern nationalists are a long way removed in many ways from the experience of a lot of people in the South. And while there'll always be a few people who are motivated enough to become involved because of that, most won't actually. Most will want some answers to the problems on their own doorstep.
The recent presidential bid of Martin McGuinness.
You do have a very strong and vocal bloc of people who are determined that Sinn Féin don't gain any kind of mainstream acceptability. And there are legitimate political, reasons why someone might object to Sinn Féin. But a lot of the coverage was so hysterical and also so ill-informed that it really, in some ways, I think it's completely counterproductive even from their own point of view.
For example?
Well, I think a lot of the stuff in the Sunday Independent, it's not researched. It has no bearing on actual, history at all. It's a reiteration of slogans about why the Provos were wrong. And it doesn't bear, to me, any kind of results of research or even, kind of attempts to understand the kind of politics of the North or the South. And I think it's just, it might make the people who write it feel better, but I absolutely think it's worthless in terms of even political debate. There's plenty of room for a critique of Sinn Féin from all sorts of political angles. but most of the coverage of McGuinness wasn't really a critique of Sinn Féin or their policies at all. It was simply a kind of knee-jerk hostility, not just to Sinn Féin, but to the idea of Northern Republicanism altogether. And that's one aspect of the presidential election, which was interesting. Now, I don't think at the end of the day it cost Sinn Féin too many votes. I think what's also interesting from the point of view of people who live in Northern Ireland, both nationalist and unionist, is the way that Southern society prioritises sacrifice in some ways. I mean, without casting any aspersions at all on the man whose father was a soldier in the Defence Forces who was killed in 1983. One Irish soldier was killed by the IRA in 30 years. And this was regarded as a reason why Martin McGuinness could not become president, a position with very little actual power. Whereas Martin McGuinness is Deputy First Minister in Northern Ireland, where the Provisional IRA killed over 1,700 people. I mean, whatever person's political views in Northern Ireland, it does seem absolutely ridiculous that people are adamant that one soldier and 7 Gardaí killed by the Provisional IRA are somehow, what it seems to Northerners, and many of them have said it, is that it seems that there is a pyramid of, sacrifice, and that the South is anything that happens in the South is regarded as far, far worse than anything. In the North, all prisoners have to be released as part of this deal. All parties have to share power as part of this agreement. But please don't tell us in the Republic that we have to accept one of them coming down here. And again, the language, of course, is instructive. So I think that's a cultural aspect of the campaign which was pretty apparent. In terms of Republican politics itself, I think what was interesting and what seemed to be completely missed, except probably by what are considered the dissident Republicans. In some ways, the rhetoric used by Martin McGuinness and Sinn Féin marked the end of anti-treaty republicanism. Martin McGuinness said that he would accept that the title Óglacht na hÉireann belonged to the Irish Defence Forces. Whether or not he means it, the fact is that is a huge step in terms of Irish Republican history. Óglacht na hÉireann were the IRA. The IRA was the army of the Irish people. The Defence Forces are the heirs to the Free State Army, the army that overthrew the Republic. Now that might seem arcane in many ways to most people, but for Republicans that was very important. And for McGuinness to say that really, in terms of presidential election, he's quite prepared to accept the Irish Army are now Óglacht na hÉireann, that really marked in some ways the death of the anti-treaty tradition, which his movement does come from. Similarly, Sinn Féin put out a statement during the election in response to critics of McGuinness and his right to stand, where they argued, and the language used was, Martin's journey is similar to that undertaken by many in our past. And they singled out De Valera, Frank Aiken, Liam Cosgrave, Michael Collins, Sean McBride. And again, that's very interesting because there are many similarities. But an Irish Republican would never have accepted that Martin McGuinness's journey had anything in common with that of Liam Cosgrave or Michael Collins or Frank Aiken or Eamon De Valera a few years ago. They would have said, no, this is something completely different. So to even suggest that there is a similarity is in fact in many ways burying anti-treaty republicanism. And I think that aspect of his campaign was completely forgotten. I suppose that the hysterics in the Sunday Independent wouldn't get the point anyway, and many Republicans mightn't want to get the point, but I thought that was a significant aspect of the presidential election.
Isn't there a substantial amount of people in the South who don't view it by the achievement or otherwise of the Republican ideal, but who view their national identity as nothing to do with the way Republicans look at it?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose another way of looking at that question is that really there is at least one generation, if not two now, for whom the Northern Ireland conflict is absolutely history, and they have no emotional or visceral response to it at all. And I was talking to a student yesterday who was doing some work on republicanism, who said to me, I don't really understand this argument about the impact of the Northern Ireland Trouble, because I just barely remember when John Bruton was Taoiseach, As far as most people in the South are concerned, Northern Ireland was fixed. There is a power-sharing government which they don't know much about the details of. They don't really know anything about the financial or other constraints on it, but it looks a lot better than it did 10, 15, certainly 20 years ago, and therefore it's over. And in terms of their worldview then, they'll continue to think of themselves as Irish and maybe even as Irish nationalists or Republicans, but within very much the constraints of the 26 county state.
That was John Dorney speaking to Dr. Brian Hanley of University College Dublin. If you would like to listen to this or previous episodes of the History Show, go to nearfm.ie/podcast/tag/the-history-show/. My name is Cathal Brennan, and thank you for listening to the History Show on Near FM.